Okay, I give it to you. This video is basically my pet peeves on death scenes. Hey guys, how are you doing today? It's P.E. Gilbert, your blogger, writing consultant, and the author to the fantasy novella, The Sultan's Daughter. And today, we're going to conclude this somewhat morbid but extremely vital topic on how to write a death scene by discussing how not to write a death scene. But before we go any further with today's video, hit that subscribe button. In recent videos, we discussed the 4 factors that are required to write an emotional and memorable death scene, as well as the 9 different types of deaths that can occur in fiction and fantasy, and this was followed by 7 unusual consequences that can arise following a death scene. At this point, I feel it is important to take note of what not to do. Thus, in today's video, we shall discuss 5 tips on how not to write a death scene to potentially prevent you from undermining a critical scene in your narrative. And I hope my tips make the writing process a little easier for you as well. 1. When death has no consequence. The 4th of the 4 factors required to write a death scene that we discussed in our previous videos states that a death must have consequence for the rest of the narrative. For example, in X-Men First Class, if Dr. Schmidt had not murdered Eric Lenscher's mother, Eric would not have become hell-bent on vengeance or become Magneto. Similarly, in Batman Begins, if Joe Chill had not shot Bruce Wayne's parents, Bruce would ultimately not have become Batman. The deaths in these stories had a significant impact on the central protagonist and on the plot, and that is what a death in a story should do, because if the death does not have an impact on the main character, it serves no narrative purpose. And if it serves no narrative purpose, it has no consequence and therefore should not have happened. Our first example of a death that has no narrative consequence is Sir Barristan Selmy's death in Game of Thrones. Sir Barristan Selmy was Queen Daenerys' bodyguard. At the end of Season 5, Episode 4, Sir Barristan is strolling around the city of Meereen for the sake of it. You know, as bodyguards in stories just do. And whilst having his stroll, he notices that Grey Worm and the Unsullied, who form part of Daenerys' army, are being attacked by the masked terrorists known as the Sons of the Harpy. Being a chivalrous knight, Sir Barristan enters the melee. He saves Grey Worm, but dies in the process. I would say that Sir Barristan died a heroic death, but he died in a gutter. Is there any heroism in dying in a gutter? More significantly for the plot, however, after he dies, Sir Barristan is mentioned in the next episode as Queen Daenerys stands over his body, and that's it. He is never mentioned again in the series, and Daenerys and all those around her seem to forget that he ever lived. Dan and Dave, the showrunners for Game of Thrones, subsequently said that Sir Barristan Selmy's death was supposed to show the world that they were going their own way with the TV series, as Sir Barristan is still alive in the books. However, for many of us online, Sir Barristan Selmy's death just showed the first of many major instances of how little they understood about how to write narrative fiction. Our second example of a death that has no narrative consequence is Eddie Dean's death in The Dark Tower. Around halfway through The Dark Tower, the 7th part of Stephen King's epic Dark Tower saga, Eddie Dean, a reformed heroin junkie, is shot and dies slowly. But apart from making the remaining major characters, Roland, Susanna and Jake, realise their own mortality, Eddie's death serves no narrative corollary. And the way Susanna's story ends begs the question of why the author killed Eddie at all. 2. When death is done for the shock factor alone. A death that shocks the audience is great. It is one of the wonders of phenomenal storytelling, as neither the characters nor the audience can see the death coming, and so are not prepared for it. Lord Eddard Stark's beheading springs to mind here, as it comes just as the audience thinks that he is going to be spared and sent to the wall. However, a death that uses the shock factor for the sake of it is not enough, and showcases how not to write a death scene because, again, a death must have narrative consequence. In the case of Lord Eddard's beheading, it does have narrative consequence. His son, Robb Stark, is crowned king in the north and ensures that the Northmen will never make peace with their enemies, the Lannisters. Thus, Lord Eddard's death meant something. If his beheading had merely been for the shock factor per se, the audience would have eventually asked, what was the point in that? As once the shock subsides, the audience is left feeling empty and unsatisfied. An example of a death that uses the shock factor for the sake of it is Severin's death in the 2012 James Bond film Skyfall. After having Severin beaten for defecting to Bond, the villainous Raoul Silva shoots her in the head, and then she is never mentioned again. I understand that her death is supposed to show us how bad, nasty and ruthless Raoul Silva is, but couldn't Severin's death have had some impact on James Bond's character? You know, couldn't it have made him want to do something to avenge her? Otherwise, why kill her? If she had just been kept alive and left to be, would it have made any difference to the narrative? I don't think so. 3. When death subverts expectations for the sake of it. Similar to a death that shocks the audience, a death that subverts the audience's expectations is great as well, provided it is done correctly. To subvert the audience's expectations correctly, the writer has to leave hints so that upon reading or seeing the narrative for a second time, the audience can pick up on the hints and ask themselves, how did I miss that? This is a hard feat to achieve, and the subversion needs to be carefully planned out. As George R.R. Martin, the author of A Song of Ice and Fire, once expertly put it at a Q&A in Edinburgh University in 2014, I've been planting all these clues that the butler did it. Then you're halfway through a series and suddenly thousands of people have figured out that the butler did it, and then you say the chambermaid did it? No, you can't do that. In short, writers cannot create a situation where character A committed the murder and all the clues lead to character A, only for character B to have done it all along. This is kind of like Nelson Muntz from The Simpsons going... Indeed, this is a fooled ya sort of trick. It's also dreadful and lazy storytelling and leaves the audience unsatisfied and with a bucket load of questions that the writer is likely to want to run away from rather than answer. For an example of a death that subverts the audience's expectations for the sake of it, let's look at the Night King's death in Game of Thrones. Sadly, Dan and Dave did not take heed of their master's words. In Game of Thrones Season 8 Episode 3, titled The Long Night, the Night King attacks Winterfell in the much anticipated battle between ice and fire. Since Season 5 Episode 8, the show had been building up for Jon Snow to have an epic showdown with the Night King. This would have made for a terrific sword fight and an emotionally logical and satisfying confrontation in the long night. But instead, the showrunners subverted the audience's expectations and had Arya Stark come out of nowhere to stab the Night King. The result was wide-eyed disbelief, the ruination of 8 seasons of build-up, and the lowering of expectations for the rest of the series. In Inside the Episode, for Season 8 Episode 3, the showrunners claimed that they had Arya kill the Night King because they believed that it didn't seem right for Jon to do it. Many fans, including myself, have since been trying to work out how they came to such a baffling conclusion. 4. When death solely makes the protagonist cry. Seeing a protagonist cry over a fallen one is both painful and beautiful to watch. It is better still if the audience can feel the same emotion as the crying character, but that is another matter. When a protagonist cries over a fallen character, it means that that character meant something to him, and it will affect the protagonist going forwards narratively. But that is the point. Going forwards. For example, after Boromir dies in The Lord of the Rings, Aragorn cries. But what makes Boromir's death narratively significant is that Aragorn changes course because of it. He decides to no longer follow Frodo to Mordor, but rather to save the kingdoms of Rohan and Gondor, to become the king he was always meant to be. If Aragorn would have just cried before following Frodo to Mordor and then living the rest of his life as Strider the Ranger, his tears would have meant nothing and Boromir's death would have been rendered pointless. But that is not the case with Aragorn's tears. They profoundly change him and ensure that Boromir's death has consequence for the rest of the narrative. Now, let us look at an example of a protagonist who cries over the death of a character, and yeah, that's pretty much it. During the aforementioned Game of Thrones episode, The Long Night, Ser Jorah Mormont dies protecting Queen Daenerys from a dozen, maybe 24 or 36 White Walkers. It's hard to say. His death might have been exactly how he would have liked to bow out. Some may even call his death heroic, as he sacrifices himself for another. However, Ser Jorah's death has no consequence on the remaining 3 episodes of the series. In the next episode, Daenerys cries before she burns his body, and that's it. The above-mentioned and much maligned showrunners later claimed in Inside the Episode for Game of Thrones Season 8 Episode 5 that Ser Jorah's death, along with Missandei's, enraged Daenerys so much that she burned King's Landing. But there is no obvious causal link between Ser Jorah Mormont dying and Daenerys going mad and burning the Westerosi capital. The fact that Dan and Dave had to make this point in the behind-the-scenes footage hints at lazy storytelling on their behalf and of them trying to cover their tracks. 5. Having a protagonist die and then bringing him back to life. Tempting as it might be to bring a beloved character back from the dead, it is one of the biggest instances of how not to write a death scene. This is because death is not a temporary absence. The death of a character in a narrative is meant to be absolute and final. Bringing a character back from the dead renders the death inconsequential and pointless. And if the death is pointless, it shouldn't have happened in the first place. For example, let's look at the death and subsequent resurrection of Optimus Prime in Transformers 2: Revenge of the Fallen. Around a third of the way through the film, Optimus Prime, the leader of the Autobots, is killed by the Decepticons. Leaving aside that he is a robot for a moment, Optimus is brought back to life before the conclusion of the film. Subsequently, in the climactic battle, he defeats the Decepticons and forces his nemesis Megatron and Megatron's sidekick Starscream to flee. Thus, Optimus's death adds nothing to the movie. Optimus might as well have been on holiday for half the film, and it would have made no difference. And if his death made no difference, why did it happen? Exception: when you can bring a character back to life. There is an exception to the above-mentioned tip. You can bring a protagonist back from the dead and still have the death have significance to the plot, i.e. narrative consequence, so long as you bring back the character changed. Our first example of how a character can come back from the dead changed is Gandalf from Lord of the Rings. In the Fellowship of the Ring, Gandalf the Grey falls into the abyss in Moria and dies. Yet, he is brought back to life in the Two Towers as Gandalf the White, a stronger and more powerful wizard. His increase in strength/power is demonstrated in The Return of the King, when he faces down his former master, Saruman. In the Fellowship of the Ring, Gandalf lost to him in a wizarding duel upon finding out that Saruman had sided with Mordor. Now though, Gandalf defeats Saruman once and for all, thereby ending the threat posed by Isengard and enabling the major characters to focus on the threat facing Gondor. Our second example of how death can change a character is Lady Catelyn Stark's transformation into Lady Stoneheart. In A Storm of Swords, the third volume in George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire saga, Lady Catelyn Stark is murdered at the Twins and then subsequently resurrected as Lady Stoneheart. Where she was once a fair-looking, multifaceted and compassionate woman, now she is unrecognisable both physically and in terms of her character, as she is a cold-hearted, vengeance-seeking creature that cannot speak. In A Feast for Crows, the 4th volume in the saga, Lady Stoneheart captures Brienne of Tarth, and in A Dance with Dragons, the 5th volume, she uses Brienne to find Sir Jaime Lannister and to lead him somewhere, presumably into a trap. But it remains to be seen what will become of those two characters and how Lady Stoneheart will affect the rest of the series. Warning: the problem with bringing a character back from the dead. If you are tempted to bring back a character from the dead, even changed, it comes with a massive warning, as by resurrecting a character, you are undermining every other death in your story. For example, after Jon Snow was resurrected in Game of Thrones Season 6 Episode 2, Charlotte Hope, the actress who played Ramsay Bolton's psychotic bedwarmer, appeared on Thronecast, the after-show to Game of Thrones in the UK. When the presenter asked her what she thought of Jon Snow's resurrection, she essentially responded, "Bring back my character." Charlotte Hope hit the nail on the head here, as once one character has been resurrected, the audience can legitimately ask, why did the writer resurrect character A, but not characters B, C and D? And once the audience starts asking this question, a red flag has been raised for 2 reasons. 1. The audience has become distracted from the narrative, which means that your story is not engaging enough or is deeply flawed. And 2. The question makes the audience justifiably believe that death in your story is nothing more than a temporary absence, i.e., it has no serious consequence going forwards narratively. Thus, in my humble opinion, I would advise against you bringing a character back from the dead. However much you may want that character to return, or however much your audience may clamour for his resurrection, it is best for the narrative if he either remains dead, or if you don't kill him off in the first place. And that's all I have for you today, guys. Thank you for watching, and I really hope you have enjoyed this video and that it helps to make the writing process a little easier for you as well. Like, comment and hit that subscribe button and tell me, what do you think of my tips? What are your pet peeves when it comes to death scenes? Moreover, my debut fantasy novella, The Sultan's Daughter, is out. If you are looking for a book that is short, fast-paced and full of suspense, then check it out. And then you'll be able to see whether or not I keep to my own writing tips as well. I have left a link for the book in the description below. Otherwise, join me next time when we'll discuss how to write the perfect ending for your narrative. Until then, keep well. Once again, guys, I just wanted to say thank you so much for watching my video. I really appreciate it and I hope you've enjoyed it. Hit that subscribe button and then you will be the first to receive more awesome content from my channel, and I hope to see you again soon.